Start? All righty, good to go. Thank you. Welcome everybody to our wildlife chat. This is just a great way to start. What is today? Monday, Thursday? Oh no, it's Tuesday. Sorry about that. I just want to go over a couple Zoom etiquette things that we all know, but I just always say them because it's on my to-do list, and so I need to make sure we're all on task right now. We have everybody on mute, and at some point when we get to the Q&A or when Susan has a more interactive part, we're going to take everybody off mute. If you do have loud background noise, you can put yourself on mute and unmute if you want to talk. And when we get to the Q&A or the interactive part, feel free to raise your hand or something like that if we miss you. I just want to start this off real quickly today. Oh, one more thing, you can use your chat at the bottom of the box, and you can open that up and you can send questions or comments to us during the meeting, to everybody or just the ESLT staff. So I would like to introduce some folks here real quickly. We've got Cheryl and Tony up here, and you can just wave if you want. They are sponsors of the week for us. And we have Roger McFarland. He and Ruth are also sponsors for the weekend. Hi, Roger. And we have staff of Carissa and Heather and Suze, who's here today, and then myself. So before we launch in, I just want to share with folks, if you don't know, hi, Ruth.
Hi, Kay. Hi, everyone.
I just want to say, if everyone remembers how ESLT was started, and it was started because a group of folks moved into a new part of an area that they realized, it was Swell Meadows, that once they were there, they realized, oh my gosh, all these houses are being built in the deer migration corridor. So they all got together and over kitchen tables and in garages and lots of really researching the right way to try to have appropriate development and protect habitat, they decided to start the Eastern Sierra Land Trust. So at the base of our foundation is protecting wildlife. And we do that in a lot of different ways. Of course, all of our conservation easements try to protect wildlife. We do our migration tour every year. We got it squeaked in this year right before COVID. So we work through our education program, and we work through on the ground measures, both in stewardship and through the conservation easements. And Suze is going to talk more about those in a few minutes. But before we hit into that, we're going to show a short little video. And I think Chris is going to show that for us. Krista, there's no sound. Nope. Oh, you're so cute, but so quiet. There's no sound, Carissa.
Sorry, everybody, there's a slight audio issue. I'm going to replay in 1 second.
And while we're queuing this up, this is taken from the DVD about ESLT that was done about 7 years ago. The whole DVD is on our website and in the portal that you can go ahead anytime, Chris. I'm just doing filler. It's on the website and on portal so that you can watch the whole thing if you want. Kristen pulled.
I don't think a person can visit the Eastern Sierra without being affected by the beauty and the drama of the landscapes. It's one of the great landscapes in North America, I think. And, we've got the high escarpment of the mountains immediately to our west, beautiful forests, shimmering lakes, and then opening off to the vast expanses of the Great Basin to the east, it can't help but affect you. So every habitat in the Eastern Sierra supports wildlife. I'm fascinated by how certain plant and animal species are dependent on habitats. The sage grouse, which is a large bird common to the plains that extends out here to the west, requires this sagebrush community for its food and its nesting habitat, but it requires big, expansive meadows in the sagebrush community for its breeding. And then we've got the riparian habitats associated with our rivers and streams that support large populations of breeding birds, and then mixed across that whole mosaic, we've got specialty habitats like seeps and springs and alkali meadows and alkali ponds, which all have endemic plants and animals not found anywhere else.
There we go. Just a beautiful little reminder of what we're all trying to protect. Thank you again, Kristen, for making that for us for today. Putting it a little snippet together for us. Now we've got, before I turn it over to Suze, we've got just a little poll that we want you to take, and it's going to pop up here any nanosecond. There we go. Yay, that worked. I love this stuff. So yeah, and then while you're taking this poll, I'm going to turn it over to Suze. Yeah, Suze is our Land Conservation Program Director. And Suze, I can't see you, but I'm going to turn it over to you to take it off from here.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I wanted to share a little bit about what Eastern Sierra Land Trust is up to these days for wildlife. And those of you who've been part of some of the earlier presentations, you've heard about the Honeywell Ranch Conservation Easement. That's kind of foremost in our minds right now, not only for its historical and agricultural values, but for its wildlife values as well. And that property is kind of a good example of, as Kay mentioned, our conservation easement strategy as a tool to work with private landowners throughout Eastern California and Western Nevada to protect land for wildlife. As Kay mentioned, we started out doing that in Round Valley for the Round Valley mule deer herd. We've expanded wildly from there. And now we're working on species that span vast areas of the Great Basin and the Sierra Escarpment, ranging from, gigantic like black bears and mountain lions to minuscule, as you saw the last frame of that video. I wish they had put a caption, was the spring snail, long spring snail, which is a very rare and imperiled spring snail found among other places at Benton Hot Springs Ranch and at Black Lake. So there's all kinds of really cool species here. But besides the conservation easements, I also wanted to let you know about something that's it's not new, but it's new for us to be involved with, which is an opportunity to work with a bunch of our public agency partners on the single most dangerous stretch of all 395, east or north to south. Happens to be in an area right here in our service area. And you probably know, if you've driven to Mammoth ever, you know this stretch. It's between the Caltrans yard and the turnoff to 203. So if you want to think of it centered on the Green Church, that's the area that is the most dangerous for wildlife on the entire highway, especially, unfortunately, for our very beloved Round Valley mule deer herd. And that little bottleneck is where the deer, they have to cross at least twice a year, and some of them unfortunately hover near the highway in that location and bounce back and forth across it, seeking out their very favorite forage, which is bitterbrush, and it's found on both sides of the highway there near Snarl. The deer, as you've probably seen driving through there, it's a really sad situation every year. There's tons of deer killed there. Well, the public agency partners, led by Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife and Mono County, have identified that location as a place they want to investigate whether there's a chance to do some wildlife crossing infrastructure. And if you've ever driven Highway 93 between Bishop and like Twin Falls, Idaho, you've probably seen some structures like this that the state of Nevada has built to pass pronghorn, mule deer, and elk especially across that very large highway. We don't know if something like that is what might end up being the outcome, or if it might be as simple as large culverts under the highway, or maybe everything in between. But the public agencies are trying to figure out right now whether it might be possible to alleviate the pressure on mule deer in that location while reducing the risks of human mortality, because the fear is, we haven't had a fatality there yet, but we do fear that that could happen. The idea of these crossings would not just work for mule deer. You probably know mule deer are a little averse to going into tunnels. They're just not evolutionarily adapted to going into dark holes in the ground. Whereas a badger or a weasel or a skunk or a mouse, it probably doesn't have too many concerns about that. But a mule deer wants to go in open air. So it might be that there are solutions found that are a mix of under the highway passes, either through existing culverts being widened or new underpasses being built. And it could be even that there are overpasses built that are vegetated and look to an animal kind of similar to the sagebrush steppe all around them, allow them to walk up and over the highway and cross safely on their migration route without having to walk through that terrifying gamut they have to pass every year, twice a year. So stay tuned for that, because one of the things that Mono County has expressed to us is the places where this has worked, and it has worked across all over the West and Canada, you have to have public support for it. In other words, you have to have the public interested in the idea of supporting wildlife overpasses or underpasses. Given the scenic nature of those, they can be made quite beautiful, but they still do provide you have to go underneath them. They obscure the view for a few seconds. And so we believe that the Land Trust could really help to achieve some public outreach and education about the need for these kind of wildlife passageways that might reduce any fears people have about, scenic impacts or traffic pattern impacts. So we're hopeful. It's something that a lot of the agency staff have been working on for many years. Caltrans has led a study to determine whether this is feasible. We're kind of in the middle of that now, doing the scientific research with pretty cool under the highway wildlife cameras that Cal Fish and Wildlife has installed to see who's using it. And they are great photos. I mean, you can see bears and spotted skunks and mule deer, and everybody is trying to get through this little section. So we know for sure that doing some kind of passageways in that area will support multitudes of species. Another thing I wanted to chat with you guys about a little bit, since we always get this question, is about sage grouse. You saw the video there of sage grouse with Dan Dawson narrating and the pronghorn nosing around. The sage grouse have recently, you probably know, were up for potential listing for the last couple of years. And then this is the second time that's happened. They were also being proposed for listing a few years back. But there's this massive group of very civic-minded ranchers and other landowners and all the public agency staff, and then groups like us, that are working together to try to see if we can protect sage grouse without the need for a regulatory overlay. In other words, can we do so well protecting their habitat that they don't ever need to be listed? In effect, we hope they won't be imperiled enough to warrant listing. So the most recent decision that happened in March is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided that that is true. In effect, that we're all doing well enough that they don't need to list. In other words, they don't need to use the nuclear option, if you will, of endangered species listing to protect this bird. We're all doing it without anyone forcing us to. We want to do it. And that's a really cool thing. It's actually a model that's been used throughout the West, but I think maybe it's a little boastful, but I think in the bi-state, it's working better than in many, many places. And part of that is because we have landowners who care a lot about their land. They want to steward it for wildlife. And even though no one is forcing them to do it, they're implementing range management and restoration projects and rotational grazing and fence alterations and all manner of things that benefit sage grouse and other wildlife because they want the bird to do well and they see the value of an intact sagebrush steppe ecosystem. So we're in a really neat place in the world, and we're in a really neat community for that. And there are others around the West looking to us as a model to find out what to do to improve non-regulatory management of species that can avert the need for an endangered species listing. So that's been really satisfying to be a part of. What else can I tell you? If you want to get involved, COVID aside, and someday COVID will be over, hopefully, and we'll be able to get back to some of our stewardship days that we do with you as volunteers and other members of the community to go out and actually help restore habitat for some of these species we care so much about. And an example of that was last year, we worked up in the Bodie Hills with Bureau of Land Management to improve that. There was an old fence up there surrounding an archaeological site, but that fence was very dangerous for pronghorn. You saw them in the video earlier. Pronghorn are the fastest animal in North America. They evolved to outrun cheetahs, North American cheetahs, back in the Pleistocene. We don't have those anymore, and actually they weren't really cheetahs. They probably looked more like mountain lions, fast mountain lions, but they were fast. And the pronghorn evolved to outrun them. And what that means is that their default response to a threat is to run as fast as they can through any barrier. They are not, of course, evolved to handle fences, and they will not jump. No matter what, they can jump. They're actually really good at jumping, and they just won't jump a fence. They will go under a fence, often at full speed. And so it's very important when you build a fence to build in pronghorn, passability to that fence if there's any chance they're going to be there, which in the Bodie Hills, you've probably seen, I hope you've seen, there's pronghorn in the Bodie Hills, and they're doing really well up there. But one thing they can't handle are bad fences. So this old exclosure fence had a lowest wire that was too low for pronghorn to safely dive underneath at full speed. And we went up there as part of National Public Lands Day and a Stewardship Day and helped remove that fence and reinstall what's called a laydown fence, which is a fence that's only up during the grazing season. And when the grazing season ends, you walk around the fence, unloop the wire, and drop that fence to the ground. So it's pretty much the best kind of fence, well, that and temporary electric fencing for wildlife passage. And this big group of volunteers went up with us and helped remove that wildlife dangerous fence and install this wildlife friendly fence. So if you'd be interested in coming out and helping us, I hope next summer we'll be able to get back out there and do some stewardship days for pronghorn and sage grouse and other wildlife. I did want to ask, I have a couple of questions. We're very lucky to have been sponsored in this event by Pupfish Cafe in Bishop. And I do have a couple of trivia questions for you, for the wildlife fans among you. I hope that's all of you. Mm-hmm. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask these questions, or I'll ask, would you like me to ask one question first, Kay, and the second? And then, and whoever gets these two questions right will win a little prize from Pupfish Cafe as our sponsor. Okay, ready? The first question is, what is the heaviest native bird in the Eastern Sierra? And this is a bird you're likely to see at Lake Crowley. It's the most common place I've seen them.
So if you guys know the answer, just raise your hand.
I think I saw Clinton first.
It's kind of a guess, but I'd city grouse.
Nope, they are big, but they're not the heaviest. Okay. So this is the largest mass of any. I used to say it's the heaviest land bird in North America, and then I was disabused of that by a person who was an expert in birds. But it's certainly one of the heaviest land birds in North America, and it's our heaviest bird.
Dawn had her hand up.
Dawn, go ahead.
I'm just gonna guess the bald eagle only because I've seen one up there.
They're beautiful, and they are really heavy, but they're not as heavy as this one. This is a bird you'll see floating on the water at Lake Crowley.
John.
I'm
gonna guess a pelican.
Yep, yeah, the American white pelican. So the American white pelican is if you ever get a chance to see them up close, and the easiest place to see them is if you go to where the Owens River empties into Lake Crowley, you'll often see them hanging around, because obviously any place there's a river or creek flowing into a lake, there's all kinds of nutrients and insects and fish. And the pelicans will hover there pretty close to shore. You can get a really good view of them, especially in the spring and early summer. But they are immense. I mean, it's amazing they can even get off the ground.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Good job, John. Well, maybe I'll ask my other one, just because we're on a roll. So what species in the Eastern Sierra owes its entire existence to a biologist and one bucket? Don?
The pupfish.
The pupfish, Owen's pupfish. There are a lot of other pupfish too, but the only one that owes its existence to a biologist and a bucket is the Owen's pupfish. You've probably read this story. I read it as a kid in Natural History magazine, but we actually still are lucky enough to have this biologist living here in our community. His name is Phil Peaster, and he's now 91. And he is the guy that rediscovered the population of the Owens pupfish over in Fish Slough, north of Bishop. But at that point, their spring was drying up, and he realized what was happening and that the entire species would go extinct if he didn't take action. So he said he walked across this very bumpy, like gopher hole ridden grassland and scooped up all the fish into a bucket and carried it back, actually 2 buckets, but for the sake of the story, he carried those buckets back to the truck. And he said multiple times that all he could think of was if he had stepped in a gopher hole and tripped, then the entire species would have gone extinct from the earth. And thank goodness he didn't trip, and that species still exists. And it's actually really easy to see, especially in the spring. If you can drive out to Fish Slough, there are some parking spots that Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife maintains. There's no signage, but you can walk down to Fish Slough and look into the water, and they're very evident because the males are a sort of iridescent turquoise when they're in their breeding colors, and they are fighting like crazy. That's where their name came from, actually. Originally, somebody thought they looked like they were playing. They are not playing, they are fighting. But they're swimming all around very quickly, defending territory, defending females. And so it's really obvious to see them in the water. And it's a fun thing to take people out to see, because it's probably the only place in the world they'll be able to see that species up close. Another species I wanted to share with you that you can go look at, and a lot of people don't realize this is a good place to see them, is the bi-state greater sage grouse. And one of the easiest places to see them right now, actually, is at Bodie State Park, at Bodie State Historic Park. They are there, especially in the early morning, if you get a chance to go to the park as early as you can get in, as early as it opens. They desire the shade, and so a lot of the places they find shade are in the shade of the buildings or even the picnic tables at the state park. So if you've never had a chance to go out at 4 in the morning on a let count, which, lucky you, this is a chance to see that bird without getting up at the crack of dawn or before dawn. And it's a really fun way to see them too, because of course they were there back when Bodie was booming. We hope that they'll be there for the next several hundred years. But it's a good place to go. And the same thing for pronghorn. If you want to drive up to Bodie and then drive up, into the Bodie Hills, it's really, you have a pretty good chance of seeing that species. The herd is, I think it's 50 or 60 animals, in a few mixes of clumps. So you'll have a better chance if you commit the day to spending it up in Bodie. I'm curious about the poll results. Did we see what species was the most commonly viewed from the group?
Yeah.
Our foundational species.
There it is.
Are there species that you guys have been looking to see that you're curious about where to find as you travel around the Eastern Sierra? Is there anything you've been kind of wondering where you might get a chance to look at it?
This is John. I really want to see pronghorn. I haven't seen the pronghorn, and I know they're in Bodie Hills. Last time I was up there for vacation and not work, I took a family member to Bodie Hill, to the ghost town, because they haven't been in decades. And I was talking to them, and they see them in the early morning as well, but we totally miss them. But I would love to see the pronghorn.
Yeah, it's a pretty good chance, especially if you go in Aurora Canyon. So if you drive north of Bridgeport and then take a right on Aurora Canyon Road and drive up to what they call the Four Corners, to where the big intersection is between all four of the routes that were built during the Bodie heyday, and then take a right, you can access Bodie Park from that northern side. It's actually, I would say, it's the most interesting way to go into Bodie, because you descend into the bowl and you can kind of squint and imagine. I mean, obviously Bodie used to be a lot bigger before the fire, but still, you can drive into it and kind of think of yourself as entering a town. That course between Aurora Canyon Road and the park is the best place, the most likely place I'd recommend to see pronghorn.
Great, I'll add it to the list.
Any other species that folks are looking for, or any species encounters you've had recently that are really fun?
And if
Has everybody had a chance to see the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep on some of the field trips? So this was another thing COVID threw a wrench in this year, but there's always next year. Keep an eye out, because you'll see in Sierra Wave and on the radio stations, there's always some tours that Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife puts on to go and see the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep, which you probably know, they're a federally listed endangered species. And when I say see them, you're seeing them at some remove, because you're watching them through spotting scopes from very, very long distance away to avoid any disturbance of the species. But the cool thing is that Cal Fish and Wildlife provides the scopes, and they're nice. They're not like my scope, they're fancy Swarovski ones. So the other cool thing about those tours that Cal Fish and Wildlife puts on is that they're staffed by the biologists who are working on that species. So you can ask all kinds of questions about the different populations and how they do their telemetry and how they do their capture program. It's a really fun time to talk to the scientists who are on the front lines of the conservation of that federally listed species. Roger?
Yes, Susan, I wanted to ask, what is the origin of those sheep?
Of the Sierra Nevada bighorns?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess they've always been here. Well, who knows who they evolved from. I guess one thing that is interesting about them is they used to be across the entire Sierra Range. And unfortunately, over the years, they've been pretty circumscribed to small populations only in certain regions of the Sierra. They were observed by John Muir. I think the population used to be substantially greater, and then they got into these weird little isolated pockets. Part of what Cal Fish and Wildlife is trying to do now is to connect them, to make sure that genetically that they remain connected as they would have historically been, a little more. And the other interesting thing about them is, I don't know if it's fully understood, the junction between desert bighorn to our east, and you can still see desert bighorn in Silver Canyon, the White Mountains, and in Nevada, of course. The trough between the Sierra and the Whites, probably provided enough of a physical barrier to the two species interacting very often in a lot of the range. You probably have seen desert bighorns. You don't see desert bighorns too often crossing the highway in front of you in the middle of Owens Valley, for example. Though they may have done so more often in the past when there was more habitat connectivity. The Sierra Nevada bighorns are a different critter. They are incredibly tolerant of terrible conditions. They eat things that don't look edible. They're standing on the high rocky escarpment. Usually I think of desert bighorns as one of the toughest creatures in our region because of what they can handle. I mean, they live in Death Valley, but they don't live at in the kind of extremes of elevation and cold that I'm pointing to the west, that the Sierra Nevada bighorns do. So I would say they're both very venerable, very admirable species, but very, very interesting and unique.
Thank you.
Suze,
Ruth?
can I follow up on what you said about, I think you said it was Fish and Wildlife Agency, are trying to connect the currently separated populations? How are they doing that? Are they
Well,
capturing and physically putting the two groups together, or how do you coax them to connect to each other?
no, what they're trying to do, Ruth, is create the circumstances that will allow the animals to move on their own if they choose to do so. And one of the primary ways they've done that in some parts of the range is through conversion of sheep grazing allotments to cattle grazing allotments. You probably remember this from the Conway Ranch project that we've been involved in. We hold a conservation easement there. And the county owns that property and recently decided not to extend a sheep grazing lease for that parcel, but instead to convert it to a cattle grazing lease. The main reason they did that is that sheep and goats, domestic sheep and goats, they can convey pneumonia to bighorn sheep, both desert bighorn and Sierra Nevada bighorn. And both of those species are utterly susceptible to pneumonia. Domestic sheep aren't. But the native bighorns, I mean, the mortality is incredibly high if they contract pneumonia. And because of their nature, you know, in a herd, if one animal contracts pneumonia and then interacts with the rest of the herd, you can lose that entire herd. So part of the ways they're trying to make the spaces between the existing animals safer for animals to move around in. And one of the ways they do that is changing grazing types, livestock types, from sheep to cattle. Now you can still have sheep in other places that are within, the way Cal Fish and Wildlife and US Fish and Wildlife deal with it is it's a sort of a buffer distance that they want to see, that they view as pretty safe. Bighorns are, as we've talked about, super hale, and if they smell a domestic sheep herd, for some reason, they can't really tell the difference. They don't know that that's not their own species. And they will walk a long way through terrible things like 395 and fences and everything to get to that domestic sheep herd to interact with the ewes. They think the ewes are bighorn ewes. And so the males, just like males in any species, in the rut season, they will go a long distance. The idea is to keep domestic sheep at far enough distance from those bighorn herds that the bighorns won't walk that far, basically, or the conditions don't allow them to walk that far. But yeah, it's there's habitat improvements you can do, but a lot of that is tough because it's such high alpine country. There's not a lot of restoration work we can alter the habitat too well with. But what we can do is make sure there's not a disease transmission risk from immediate access to domestic sheep herds.
That's really interesting. But I guess the ability of those state agencies to manipulate which animals are grazing in a particular area depends on the agency having authority over that particular land area. So does this tie in with things like ranchers' grazing rights on public land, BLM land and so forth? Because you can't influence what private property owners are doing in terms of whether they're grazing cattle or sheep on that side of the fence, sort of thing. So is that where they have some ability to control which of the domestic animals are actually grazing on particular areas of land?
Yes, they do. So the partner agencies, which in this case the agencies that hold the grazing allotments, are the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. And they're both working in concert with Cal Fish and Wildlife and US Fish and Wildlife to identify those kind of places where sheep grazing maybe isn't a good choice, but cattle grazing wouldn't cause the same kind of problems. I should say cattle don't transmit pneumonia to sheep. So cattle with bighorn are safe in that regard. The other thing that's kind of neat is, even though you're right, private property owners retain the right to graze whatever livestock they choose to do. But we as Eastern Sierra Land Trust can work with private ranchers when we write conservation easements to limit the types of livestock that are permitted on that agricultural operation only in areas where it's truly a sort of immediate threat to other wildlife like bighorns.
Mhm.
An example of that is Cinnamon Meadows Conservation Easement. You guys might remember this one we did up near Dunderberg Peak a few years back. And on that easement, with the landowner's involvement, he wanted this, we wrote that easement to prohibit sheep grazing, domestic sheep grazing, even though historically the Forest Service around that property had originally been used for sheep as a sheep allotment. But the private landowner decided he didn't want to create this threat to bighorns, and we wrote it into the easement. So forever after now, that private owner decided for that property it wouldn't be a threat to bighorns. Even on the Honeywell easement, because if those of you who were here yesterday and saw the map of the Honeywell Ranch Conservation Easement, there are a bunch of parcels going up Buckeye Canyon. Some of those are too close, in the opinion of fish and wildlife biologists, to the bighorn herd nearby. And so the Honeywells allowed us to write language into the easement that prohibits sheep grazing on those pieces that are in Buckeye Canyon, and even limits sheep grazing on the core ranch to certain times of year and certain parts of the property to reduce that risk of the bighorn ram walking all the way down to interact with the Honeywell sheep. Because the Honeywells do have some sheep and goats, but they agreed to manage their herds in a way that would reduce the risk to bighorn. So we can change action on some private landowners' property with their consent.
Great, thank you. That's encouraging news. That's great. Thanks.
Thanks, Suze. I just want to note that we're over our published time, but if everybody would like to stay, I think I'm not sure about Suze's schedule, but I think we have a few more minutes. So if you would, if you want to keep going, if you've got any additional questions or comments, we can hang on. Done.
I had another question for Suze. What's I understand for the count of the sage grouse why you'd want to keep it off the endangered species list, but what's the disadvantage of it being classified as an endangered species?
Once a species goes on the list, the amount of consultation that has to go on between all the agencies engaging in restoration and management projects on the public lands is, I don't even know how to describe it. Maybe not it's not logarithmic, but it's incredibly time consuming and slow and complicated to work through all the required public land or public agency consultations once the animal has been listed. The reason that we don't want that is that a lot of work for bi-state sage grouse, and this is somewhat true over the rest of greater sage grouse range in the Great Basin, but especially in the bi-state, there are places where months matter, years really matter, but even months matter to do the restoration and enhancement on a time frame that will cause the lek or the brood rearing habitat to remain vital to the species. And an example of that would be, in the Bodie Hills, there are some properties that have meadow irrigation that is kind of, it dates back to the Bodie days. It's not very efficiently done. And the problem is sage grouse chicks are dependent upon meadows in the early part of their lives because they eat the insects that grow in the kind of wet, mucky meadows. Well, if the irrigation systems in those meadows aren't well managed, you lose a lot of habitat for leks that are already impacted by invasive weeds, invasive conifer trees, the Bodie road, West Nile virus. So you have animals that are already kind of struggling, and the thing you can do if you don't have a listing is go in there, work with the public agencies and improve that irrigation system, fix the down cutting of the creeks, remove fences that are causing problems for wildlife. It's much swifter. Once the bird is listed, every single thing you want to do out there, you have to consult with everyone under the sun, and it takes forever. even as it is, it takes a long time. The agencies try to propose projects every year. They have to go through appeals. They have to go through all kinds of scientific rigor to make sure they're doing the right thing. When you add listing on top of that, now you're adding months or years to the time it'll take to get those projects on the ground. So it's, I would call it a, you know, you have, it seems like it would be a good thing. As you know, when I think of the Endangered Species Act, I think of it the way I learned about it as a kid, which is, you know, you want to have the protections the Endangered Species Act brings. But that the reason that when I think of that as a kid, I think of like the American alligator or the peregrine falcon or the bald eagle, you know. Well, the reason that the Endangered Species Act was necessary is because peregrine falcons' eggs were being, you know, they were being crushed by the weight of the adults sitting on the clutch. And American alligator had been hunted. And like all, I mean, they were under extreme levels of pressure without a group of community members trying their hardest to keep that animal from, you know, from going extinct. We're not in that situation here. We do have that community, really strong community base, trying, like with every action that's taken in these public lands to improve habitat for the sage grouse. So when you're on death's door, I agree. Then the Endangered Species Act, that's what it was made for. It was made to handle things when nothing else would work. But right now, what we're doing as a community is working. And I think that's what's really gratifying about it.
I'm going to take a nap before my
Any other questions?
I have another question. What is the species that ESLT is most concerned about right now? Like out of all the species, the sage grouse, the pronghorn, the pupfish, what's the one of biggest concern?
Well, you know, I try really hard not to look at things on a one species basis, because the things that we're doing, we deliberately do to positively affect large numbers of species. And I heard once a biologist at the Nature Conservancy where I used to work say, our goal should be to keep common things common. And some of what we do is doing that. I mean, in a way, you know, mule deer are not endangered species. They're not imperiled on a statewide basis. But here, they're so precious because they are one of the last large migratory ungulates we have in this part of the state. We celebrate them, even though they have no, you know, listing status. I think the thing we try to do with our conservation easements and our stewardship projects and our collaboration with all of our public agency partners is find projects and properties where we can kind of do the most good for the greatest number of species while benefiting our other mission, you know, our other parts of our mission, like historical resources, archaeological resources, scenic values, agricultural lands. We try to pick projects that are kind of a smorgasbord. And I can't think of an easement right now that I've worked on where it was focused on one thing to the exclusion of anything else. We try to bring in as many species as we can. So as an example, like the Honeywell Ranch Conservation Easement, you know, it was funded through sage grouse money in the Farm Bill, and through sage grouse primarily through the State Wildlife Conservation Board. But California Deer Association provided funding for that easement. And there's all kinds of crazy riparian habitat for all really cool warblers and things up Buckeye and Eagle Creeks especially. The headwaters of the East Walker River are on the property, and there's this incredible bear, like, I don't know, like a bear meeting ground, bear Chautauqua at the top of the East Walker headwaters, that we've never seen the bears, we just see their tracks, but it just looks like, you know, a conference that they're having up there. So it's you know, the easement on the face of it is a sage grouse easement for agricultural land. But we know from now having done all the field work to do the baseline documentation, the place is crawling with pollinators, you know, songbirds, raptors, ungulates, badger. There's American badger out there, which is really cool. State species of special concern. So I don't think of any one species as being the one that we lose sleep over. We're kind of trying to protect habitat for this biggest swath.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You did a great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I hope in future years, once our stewardship days get back in action, that you guys will join us and see some of these places. And even if you don't want to come out on a stewardship day, we will have field trips. Most years in Lands and Legacy, we have a lot of cool field trips, and hopefully next year will be no exception. We hope that with the Honeywell's permission, we'll get a chance to go and see some of that property and some of the others that we've done in the past, and some ones that we hope you'll hear about soon that we'll be finishing up in the near future.
Thanks, Suze. Thanks, everybody. Is there anything else I'm supposed to say before we let folks go? Because I just want to remind everybody we've got some more events here. Tonight we've got, and again, let's thank Pupfish. They just came on, I think yesterday, the day before. It's a wonderful local small cafe here that I recommend to folks if you're in town. And tonight we've got a ESLT Happy Place book club meeting, and we've got the author of the new Miracle Country book, Kendra Atlework. She's going to be with us, and it's going to be a really wonderful time. And then you can see in the next couple of days, we've got Bill Bramlett out at Benton is going to be speaking about the history of Old Town Benton and a little bit about our easement there. And Thursday, the BioBlitz final. So if you haven't done the BioBlitz, check out the information on the portal. It's pretty fun. And then we'll be doing our paddle raise at 6 o'clock. So I hope you can join us. And again, if you've got any questions for us or comments, please send us an email or give us a buzz, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought the battle raise was 5 o'clock.
Did I say 6?
You did.
It is 5. What time is it? I think it's 5 o'clock. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Roger. That's
on Thursday.
Okay, 5 o'clock on Thursday. Whew, I would have missed it. Thank you, Roger.
I didn't want to miss it.
I don't want you to miss it either. So we'll all be there. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Okay, see you soon. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.